All right, for today's lesson, for lack of a better term, we're going to be talking about fingerprints. This whole week is going to be dedicated to fingerprints. This specific video is kind of like a mishmash of two different topics within fingerprinting, but I didn't want to give you two different videos, so I'm just going to make one, maybe a little bit longer than I'd like it, but one video that kind of talks about all of the cool things about fingerprinting. So to get started, let's just talk about what they are. So fingerprints at this point in time offer an infallible means of personal identification because the current theory is that no two people have the same fingerprint, right? So if that is true, that means that if a fingerprint is left at like a crime scene or something, it can be traced back to one singular person and one singular person only. This is a huge ally for the forensics community because it is it's a perfect way to identify a criminal or someone who is at a crime scene. So the origin of this is pretty unclear, but fingerprints have been traced back to 1792 BC. Okay, so people were pushing their fingers into clay and leaving their fingerprints around. So from there to now, this has sort of evolved, and now we use fingerprinting to match evidence to suspects. Because I'm a science teacher, you know that this is important to me, but fingerprinting is the natural secretions of the sweat glands in the skin. So if you look at I'm looking at my thumb right now, but you can see all of the ridges in your fingerprints, and in that, what leaves the print behind is the sweat and like the oil from your skin that gets caught in those ridges of your skin. So you leave that specific pattern behind because that sweat and oil is stuck in those ridges until you touch something else and it stays there. So there are three kind of general patterns, and again, look at your fingers while you're looking at this. You can tell what fingerprints align with these general patterns. So a small portion of the population have what's called an arch, and that's that first picture. I personally do not have any arches, but that's okay. I am apparently not of the elite 5%. And then whorls are 30%, and loops is the majority at 65% of the population. Within that, though, there are patterns and ridges and minutiae that we'll talk about that kind of identify specific fingerprints to specific people. So there is a core, which is the center of a loop or whorl. So if you have, like I have mostly loops, but I do have a whorl, and in the dead center of the whorl would be the core. And then a delta is a triangular area near that core, and from there you can do what's called a ridge count. So you would count how many ridges are in between the core and the delta, and this is what distinguishes one fingerprint from another, is that ridge count and where in particular on your fingerprint is the core and the delta. And you can go even further. So there are types of whorls like a central pocket loop, double loop, and an accidental whorl, and it kind of determines like where the deltas are and where the core is. So you can kind of see that the deltas are in different areas on these whorls, and the accidental whorl has 3 deltas, so it's just a matter of like looking at the other components, like the other minutiae like deltas and cores, to determine the general pattern. And then there are types of arches as well, a plain arch and then a tented arch, which you can see that there's a delta in the middle of that. So that's sort of like your general information about fingerprinting itself, like what are fingerprints, what do they look like, and now this is like the second piece of this lecture, and this is more just sort of about like CSI and fingerprinting, like how does it relate to forensics itself. I thought that this would be like more what you guys are interested in, but I wanted to give you that background because you're going to need it for the assignments. So with CSI, the reason that fingerprints are so important is because they don't change during a lifetime. Of course, you've seen movies where like people will dip their fingers in acid to burn off their fingerprints. John Dillinger did this. He was like an old like mafia guy from like the 1920s. But of course you can mess it up if you like cut your finger and there's a scar or something, but typically they remain unchanged. And the individuality of a fingerprint is not determined by its general classification, but by the minutia. So like I said, you're not going to get an individual fingerprint by saying it's a whorl or it's a loop. You're going to get it by pointing out the deltas, the cores, the different ridges, and that's known as minutia. A fingerprint analyst compares common ridge patterns between suspect prints and evidence prints, and that's how you actually end up with, you know, when you see on CSI, when you see all those fingerprints flying by, and then you see, oh, a 99% match. Like, that's what a fingerprint analyst does, is like goes through and actually compares all of those ridges to see if there's a match. So some minutia patterns that they're looking for, these are some common ones, right? You have like a fork, an island ridge, a dot in the middle, and you can see on the right-hand side, like you can see where all of those pieces are in the actual fingerprint. They are small. Like, think about your fingerprint. It's kind of small, right? So it takes a lot of effort to be able to identify these patterns, but you guys are going to be practicing this in class. And so for years, experts have debated how many ridge comparisons are necessary to identify, like, to say that this is a match, and different jurisdictions require different numbers, which is kind of an issue, really, right? Because if someone gets called up in court and they only have to match, you know, 5 or 6 minutia versus in a different state they have to match 18 or 20, that's a huge discrepancy. And so people could potentially get off on a crime because they didn't have enough minutia, where in another state they might have been convicted, right? So it just, there is a general 8 to 16, but even within that, that's a huge range. So just keep that in mind. And then some other experts believe that fingerprints aren't even an exact science and shouldn't be used as the only means of conviction. So people are kind of like all over the place with using fingerprinting in convicting someone of a crime. Now, when we're talking about crime scenes, there are 3 different types of fingerprints that you can find at a crime scene. There's visible prints, which is, you know, when your fingers touch a surface after they've been in contact with something. So like a bloody fingerprint, or you have ink on your fingers and you leave a fingerprint, right? That's visible. Plastic prints are impressions. So like if you put your finger in putty or dust, right? It leaves a fingerprint, but it's not, you pushed your finger into something. You didn't just like leave a visible print. And then a latent print is invisible, right? It's something that like maybe you touched your phone or something, your phone screen, and there's definitely a fingerprint there, but you wouldn't really be able to see it unless you maybe put some powder on it or something to actually make it a little bit more visible. So if you're locating visible or plastic prints at a crime scene, it's normally like a little problematic, whereas locating it's a little problematic, but it's much easier to locate those prints versus locating latent prints, because they're invisible, right? So it's much harder to see something that's invisible than it is to find like a bloody fingerprint on the door handle or something, right? Of course, there are recent advances in technology which makes it a little bit easier, like using ultraviolet image converters, or what's called a reflected ultraviolet imaging system, which can locate prints on most non-absorbent surfaces. This is awesome because it doesn't need chemicals or powders. I know like back in the olden days, you would like see people going around and like brushing powder on door handles and stuff. Like you've maybe seen that in movies or TV shows or something, but now they just kind of like go over it with a UV light and they're like, oh look, there's a print. It's much easier now. This is what it looks like, so you can kind of see that you would see the prints if they were there. It's a nice handheld thing. You can kind of just like easily move through a crime scene and look for prints. It's just a lot more straightforward, a lot more streamlined. Now, as mentioned, you can still use powders to make latent prints visible, and there's a lot of powders that you can use in different colors and compositions, and you apply them with like brushes. Most times you would use like a black or a gray powder, and then you would be able to bring up the images of the latent print if they were there. But when you're using powder, you have to be really careful, because if you're dusting it and then lifting it, if you're not really precise and you mess that up, you've just lost your whole print. Whereas with the UV, you can see it and you can record it, right? You can like actually have that print in the machine itself, right? Whereas this, it's like you got to be really careful. Of course, there's other methods, right? There's always other methods, but the powders and the UV light are like the main types of ways to collect fingerprinting at crime scenes. So once a fingerprint is identified and collected, they're run against what's called AFIS. And AFIS is the automated fingerprint identification system. It has nearly 50 million fingerprint records. And if you guys remember me telling you that like when I was younger, my parents like signed a permission slip so I could go and like play on a fire truck and a police car and all that, and they took my fingerprints as like a fun thing. Well, my fingerprints exist in the AFIS system because when I was younger, my parents let me go on this field trip and they took my fingerprints, and now I'm in my fingerprints are for sure in this record, in this system. So it contains so many fingerprint records, and this computer system can scan a digitally encoded fingerprint so that you can kind of compare it to all of the other ones in this system and go through high-speed computer processing, which makes it significantly easier to locate a match than if you were to do it by hand. And then you can kind of determine what percentage you have of a match and the degree of correlation to see if you have an actual suspect. And this is what that looks like. So you can kind of see that you have all these matches in here, and you can look at it and you can do different colors, and you can see what it would look like if you were to be comparing different fingerprints. And you see that you have like a matching score of 100%, you've matched 24 minutia, like this is a good match, of course, right? Like 100%. And that is everything for today. You guys are going to be practicing looking at minutia and looking at fingerprints, and if we get lucky, you will even be taking your own fingerprints to see what your prints look like. All right, so see you next time.